Due to activist work both on the inside and the outside, this low-life scum story is also a Frontlines report. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the low-life scum aspect of solitary confinement, often called segregation or administrative confinement, or AC by the folks in the biz who like to sugarcoat evil. As I mentioned in the spoken word earlier, the cells are typically somewhere around 6 by 8 feet, oftentimes outfitted with steel doors and solid walls where neither light nor sound penetrates. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day and are sometimes, but not always, allowed an hour of quote-unquote recreation, where they are taken to another cell and essentially walked around in shackles. The original idea behind solitary confinement was to punish prisoners who were particularly violent, keeping them in solitary for a few days, maybe even up to a week, as punishment. And I would argue that even that is some fucked up torture bullshit, but that is nothing compared to what solitary confinement has become. Human Rights Watch reports that no longer a matter of spending a week in the hole, prisoners classified as dangerous or disruptive can spend years and even decades in solitary confinement. And with regards to who gets classified as dangerous or disruptive, your guess is really as good as mine, because there is no standard or rule, and there's certainly no oversight. The criteria for determining entry to and exit from administrative segregation, particularly in super maximum security facilities, are so vague that arbitrariness and unfairness are inevitable. Few jurisdictions have careful internal review systems to provide an effective check on unnecessary or unduly prolonged solitary confinement. Moreover, few states have an impartial and independent authority, such as an ombudsman or inspector general, who can monitor supermax conditions and provide inmates with an effective recourse against unnecessary or unduly lengthy solitary confinement. So really, you can get thrown in the hole just because a dickhead guard doesn't like you, or because you were tied to a disruption in general population and no one cares enough to see if that's true or not. And if you're mentally ill, much like on the outside, prisons either have no resources to care for you or don't want to, or a combination of the two. So the easiest thing to do is just to shove you in the hole. Again, Human Rights Watch estimates that anywhere from 1/5 to 2/3 of prisoners held in solitary confinement have a serious mental illness, which was diagnosed or manifested before isolation. And while no one will argue that prisons are ill-equipped in everything from clean air to mental health services, the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law wrote in a 2010 report that, quote, segregation of mentally ill prisoners, or any other prisoner, is not an unintended consequence of tight budgets, for example. It reflects a penal philosophy and the conscious decision by prison officials about whom to isolate, for how long, and under what conditions. The authors go on to write that it is the ethical duty of health professionals to advocate against solitary confinement, to not turn a blind eye to the clear and documented effects of solitary, which include anxiety, depression, anger, cognitive disturbances, perceptual distortions, obsessive thoughts, paranoia, and psychosis. The adverse effects of solitary confinement are especially significant for persons with serious mental illness, commonly defined as a major mental disorder, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, that is usually characterized by psychotic symptoms and/or significant functional impairments. The stress, lack of meaningful social contact, and unstructured days can exacerbate symptoms of illness or provoke recurrence. Suicides occur disproportionately more often in segregation units than elsewhere in prison. All too frequently, mentally ill prisoners decompensate in isolation, requiring crisis care or psychiatric hospitalization. The article goes on to cite examples of prisons that do not utilize solitary, and lo and behold, prisoners respond more favorably to, say, group therapy than to being locked in a dark fucking hole for 23 hours a day. And while solitary confinement for youth was banned earlier this year, thousands of prisoners still suffer the extreme psychological torture that accompanies this practice. And a handful of those are at Wupan Correctional Institute in Wisconsin. Starting this Friday, June 10th, prisoners at WCI will begin a hunger strike in protest of solitary confinement. Cesar de Leon, a prisoner who is currently serving in solitary, described the conditions in a press release. Prisoners in solitary at WCI are never allowed to go outside or see the sun. The 1 hour per day of recreation that they're allowed out of their bathroom-sized cells is spent in an indoor recreation cage, which is often filthy with urine and feces because once a prisoner is moved to the cage, requests to be allowed access to the bathroom are ignored by staff. Prisoners in administrative confinement, AC, are not only extraordinarily isolated from general population, but also from loved ones and spiritual leaders. AC prisoners are allowed one 15-minute phone call and one 15-minute video visit per week. The calls and conferences are closely monitored and can be cut off with very little pretext. And if you recall from episode 63, video visitations are more often than not embarrassingly low quality and unreliable. The only human interaction that these prisoners have is with prison guards, oftentimes the original cause of their confinement. In conjunction with the hunger strike, supporters are organizing 2 rallies, one in Madison and one in Milwaukee, on June 10th and 11th, respectively, where life-size replicas of the tiny cells will be on display, and family members, activists, and legislators will speak out in support of the strikers and against solitary confinement. There will also be a letter writing and phone pressure campaign to support the demands of the prisoners, which include an end to solitary confinement, the implementation of an oversight committee to stop abuse of prisoners, and the establishment of proper mental health facilities and treatment of short and long-term solitary confinement prisoners. To learn more about the events this coming weekend in Wisconsin and read first-person accounts of solitary, go to solitarytorture.blogspot.com.